services practice. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Terrance Evans. I am a partner at Wayne Morris, where I co-chair our banking and financial services practice, and also our diversity and inclusion program. I also am proud to be the new president of the Charles Houston Bar Association, which is the oldest Black bar association in California. And I am the co-chair and co-founder of the CLA Racial Justice Committee. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to have a conversation with longtime civil rights lawyer, Walter Riley. Walter has a long history of fighting for justice and civil rights, dating back to his childhood. He was born and raised in Durham, North Carolina. He joined the civil rights movement very early in his life. He organized protests, picket lines. He sat in on lunch counters to desegregate them. He helped desegregate movie theaters. He had conversations with iconic civil rights leaders like Malcolm X, Floyd Mckissick. He moved to the Bay Area in 1965, and he joined the 1968 student strike for ethnic studies at San Francisco State University. Eventually, he settled in Oakland, and he worked to become a very successful civil rights attorney and activist. And he has continued in the fight and in the struggle for justice. For more than 60 years of his life, he has devoted himself to the cause of fighting for racial justice, civil rights, and equality for all. And he is still fighting today. Walter, thank you so much for being here and for being part of this discussion and all that you have done over the course of your life in the fight for justice. I would like to share some photographs from your history in fighting for civil rights. But before I do that, are there any preliminary words that you would like to share with the audience?
Oh, well, thank you for having me here. And I really appreciate Alameda County Bar Association and the work that you do with Charles Houston and trying to develop racial justice. Absolutely necessary at this time. We'll talk more about it, but I appreciate all the work that's being done and the people here. And I'm particularly inspired right now at the age of 77 that there is a chance for a lot more to progress to be made.
Absolutely. I am going to share my screen with everyone, and we're going to look at some photographs that tell part of the story of your fight for civil rights and justice. Walter, are you able to see my screen right now?
Yes, I am.
This is
a photograph. Yes.
Yeah. This is one of the photos that shows you here with the great attorney Floyd Mckissick and Malcolm X. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in this photograph?
Well, this is a photograph of a press conference with Floyd Mckissick and Malcolm X. And that time, Malcolm was still part of the Nation of Islam. And I was MC at a program for him, speaking with Floyd Mckissick. There was a difficult time for getting a place to speak because most of the places that we had put together canceled once they started getting pushback from various folks in the white community. But I was chair at that time of the local organization that was statewide work, and I was field secretary for CORE at that time. But this was a meeting of CORE and NAA folks. It's a long history, a lot of story in that particular time when we spoke. So.
And just so that folks understand, we have, of course, Malcolm X on the right, and we have attorney Floyd Mckissick in the center, and that's you on the far left?
That's me on the far left, yes, of the photograph.
And
Floyd Mckissick.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about Floyd McKissick?
Well, Floyd Mckissick was a nationally known attorney at that time. He was a pioneer in the movement in the South. He later became the chair of the Congress for Racial Equality and finally became a federal judge. But he pioneered a lot of the work in the area around fighting to develop a movement to end the segregated system that existed. We fought for jobs. A primary approach was fighting for jobs. One of the things that I remember clearly about Floyd McKissick is that he said that, and I followed that work, that famously that we are not nonviolent philosophically, we are nonviolent tactically, because we don't have the ability to fight a violent struggle with the racist system that exists. We use this tactic. And that was part of the political approach of a lot of folks, particularly a lot of young people in the movement at that time. It's important to remember that.
And can you speak to some of the economic challenges that many folks were dealing with during that time? Because you mentioned that you all were fighting for jobs. What was it that made it, the focus of what you were fighting for? Because I think a lot of folks, when they're thinking about the civil rights movement in the 60s, they're thinking about desegregation of public places, but I don't think people think enough about the economic challenges that African Americans and other people of color had at that time.
Yeah, well, the fight for jobs was a major aspect of the civil rights movement. That included tactics for picketing stores that didn't hire Black people, challenging the hiring policies at major industries. We fought for jobs and we fought for equality in the jobs, and we supported the movement. Durham, North Carolina was a center for the tobacco industry, manufacturing cigarettes. And so there were Black people working in the factories, and that was a major economic backbone for Durham, North Carolina at that time. Tremendous economic development was developing in the fight with Black folk involved. But we fought for and supported the unionized work that was being done among the factory workers. In the 50s and the early 60s, many of the unions in the South were segregated. So there were Black unions, and there was a time when unions started to merge. And when they merged, Black folk were at the bottom of the seniority list. And that was a long struggle, particularly in a place like North Carolina, where we had industrial workers in the tobacco industry who had fought in the wars, particularly young folk coming back from Korea, playing a role in the union movement. So we were connected to that. I was a liaison with the labor movement as a high school student and an organizer. And later, in my early years after I graduated, was a civil rights a field secretary for CORE throughout the Southeast. And our program was to ensure that Black folk got jobs. Now, a lot of places didn't have the opportunities that we had in Durham with factory work, but factory work was the only place that was open. We weren't able to get jobs in the other aspects of the industry, and it's the Center for Medical, providing medical resources for folks. Still is at this point. Black folk were not getting those jobs in that period in the industry. Black folks were not getting jobs in the retail industry. We were able to use our economic power, and we've always had economic power, buying things, buying goods, particularly buying retail stores. And we started using that. We organized around that all over the Southeast to ensure that we got jobs in those retail industries. We wanted to get jobs in the cotton mills. We wanted to get jobs in the financial institutions. By the way, Durham had at that time, the largest Black-owned business in the world, North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. And the Mechanics and Farmers Bank was Durham organized at that time, independent of any other banking system, was Black-owned. And there was North Carolina Mutual credit union. And those had been organized since the turn of the century. So we had some of those resources in Durham, but it didn't exist in most other places. And we were able to play a major role in moving people to fight around these issues. Durham is one of the places there was a Black Wall Street, like in some other places, but those places were few and far between in this country. I came from a tobacco family. We had, until 1950 and in the early 50s, we were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And I was born in a place that was built by enslaved people, dirt floor, and most of my family were in those places in the beginning. I was the second person in my family to graduate high school. And my brother, 2 years older than I, ninth of 11 children. And there were hardships that we faced, and when we understood that, most of us who got involved in the movement carried that energy and insights into the work that we were engaged in.
Can you talk a little bit about sharecropping? You mentioned that your family, your father was a farmer and were sharecroppers. My grandfather was a sharecropper in Tennessee. And I think some folks don't really understand what that concept is like. Following slavery, you had a lot of Black folks who ended up as sharecroppers. What exactly did that mean when you were a sharecropper? Whose land were your father and other folks working on?
The land that the farmers worked, Black farmers worked, was the land that had been owned by the antebellum landowners, slave owners. I grew up in an area that I could walk to see my great grandmother's house, where she was born as a slave and where she lived and died when she was enslaved. And that was the nature of the community that we lived in. So we worked on the land that the enslaved folks had worked, and we raised the cash crops in North Carolina around Durham, tobacco, that the enslaved folks had worked to make folks rich, to build the backbone of the economic empire that grew out of the tobacco industry. They had to work pay for their rent. That's why it was called in sharecropping, by giving the owner of the land the major portion of the profit that was made. So the owner would sometimes give a stake, and sometimes they didn't give a stake in buying the seeds or the plants or the fertilizer that kept things growing. Sometimes they charged more than it was necessary, more than the market value of those products when they bought them. So sometimes many farmers would try and buy it themselves, but most people didn't have the resources, didn't have the financial support to ensure that. So they generally ended up poor and remained poor, because that was the nature of a system that got 75% of the profit made from the hard work of a whole family for an entire year. And families would be forced to move on if the farmer thought that they were going to get a better deal from another group, from the next farmer. And that was true for white farmers too. There were white farmers who were doing the same thing, having to work the land for the owner of the land, who were the descendants of the slaveholders.
And wasn't it also an issue? It almost sounds like this sharecropping is kind of like a different form of slavery, economic slavery, for a lot of the families who found themselves, working land basically owned by white men. Would that be a fair characterization? It was like a different
Yes.
way of enslaving Black folks. And also during this time, and I remember stories from my grandparents and my parents telling me, it was difficult for Black folks to acquire land. Many times white people wouldn't sell land to Black people. And there were many times Black folks were cheated out of land. They would, find ways to save their money, buy it, and find themselves cheated out of the land that they had worked so hard for. Are you familiar with any of those stories where it was hard for Black folks to acquire property?
I know those stories. Yes, Black folk could not buy land. My father was a good farmer. He was able he was recognized in the community as someone who knew what planting was about and husbanding the land. So he was able to amass enough money to buy a place. But prior to that, we had lived on a place where he was doing fairly well, and white folks, poison all our animals.
Wow.
And so we had to move to where I actually grew up in Bragtown, Durham, North Carolina. Eventually we got there, and he continued to farm. My mama said, it's enough for my young kids. The older kids had farmed, worked, plowed at adolescence, plowing behind a mule, and mom didn't want us younger kids. I'm the ninth child, like I say, doing all that. She says to my dad, you got to do something more. So he continued to farm, but got a job working in construction. Started off as a menial labor worker and ended up being a machine operator. But the idea that one could buy land was a problem then, and it still is a problem. People in Southwest are being lands being stolen from folks for all kinds of reasons. Large families are being separated from the land that their parents had fought and spent their life trying to build. It has become part of the criminal justice system too, because bail agencies across the country are taking land from folks. You go do some research about what's happening in some of the old Southern Confederate states. Bail companies, as part of the banking system and the court system, is taking land from Black folk who have worked a lifetime and generations to acquire land. I know that happened in my community. People don't have resources to pay bail. The bail system itself is so unfair that you have to find a financier to get you out. If whatever it happens to be, you get caught and arrested, sometimes just for traffic issues, minimal issues. We remember that from the demonstrations that occurred in various parts of the country last year and in the recent years. Communities are impoverished because of a criminal justice system that requires people to pay bail, to pay fines that they shouldn't be paying otherwise, or to give some more justice and equity in that. So land is still a major issue in this country, where Black folk and working people are being denied the ability to maintain and hold on to their land, which is a major aspect of gaining wealth in this society.
And I see a lot of parallels between your life experience and what I've read and what I've heard from family members. Many of the same experiences as it related to sharecropping, and of course, the redlining, and of course, the numerous massacres where Black folk who had managed to build communities for themselves, build homes for themselves, schools, other businesses, had that really taken away from them in a lot of these massacres that aren't even taught about in schools, where everything they had burned down to the ground. You talked about your family's animals poison. Everything these Black communities have, we think of Roseville, we think of Greenville, South Carolina, and numerous other examples of that. I want to talk a little bit.
Wilmington.
Yeah.
Wilmington, North Carolina is a major aspect of the struggle, where masses of folks, government involved and organized military and police involved in massacring Black folk and destroying community.
And it kind of is a perfect segue into a lot of the activism that you did in San Francisco as a student. I think a lot of folk, when we talk about civil rights, when we talk about Jim Crow, there's a misunderstanding about California and the role that California played in a lot of this. There was a lot of racism, and there's still a lot of racism in California, a lot of segregation. But you were really one of the leaders in your youth fighting against injustice. And here we have a picture of you in 1968 at San Francisco State. Can you tell us what's going on in this picture and what you were fighting for here?
Well, this is the San Francisco State strike. This is in the spring of '68. The major strike occurred in '68, '69. This is '67, '68. I left state in '68 and became a bus driver in San Francisco, a mini driver, where I organized a Black caucus that played a major role in developing things, and we put together a movement to support developing a union there. But at this time, it's the fight for open admissions. It was one of the major issues that's not talked about there. But we wanted more Black students recruited, admitted to the San Francisco State. We wanted that change in California State itself, and we wanted Black studies. We wanted ethnic studies. It's developed into various things across the country, but this is the first strike, the first effort at developing ethnic studies in this country, out of which all the various ethnic study departments develop from our movement there for Black studies. And that was what we wanted, an education that taught us about our history, gave us an opportunity to have discussions among ourselves and students, learning how to develop political and social struggles, understanding, political analysis that helped us to advance in our lives in society, to make changes, a struggle for change. That's what's the struggle for ethnic studies.
And, you know, as I look at that picture and I hear the struggles that you and those around you had fighting for ethnic studies and Black studies, it reminds me of my days at Cornell University. So back in 1999, feel like an old man for saying that, but back in 1999, we were fighting to keep Black studies at Cornell University. It was right around the time that you had a lot of the anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-affirmative action propositions. There was one in California in particular. And the administration at Cornell was considering getting rid of all ethnic studies programs. And I was a double majoring in Africana studies. And so we protested, the Black people there, and this was in 1999, so about 30 years after you started the program that gave us the Black studies in the first place. And we blocked traffic going into and out of the university. And I remember it was cold, it was in the middle of winter, and we laid our bodies out in the street. No traffic could go in and out for about 10 hours. We were freezing because we wanted to send a message that you are not going to take away our Black studies. And the only reason we had it was because of you. You fought to give us the Black studies in the first place, and we were fighting to keep it. And it almost seems like we keep refighting many of the same battles over and over again. What are your thoughts about that? Where it seems like we're on this, you know, this wheel where we keep fighting the same battles over again. It seems like we never really get beyond the same struggle.
It does seem that way a lot of times, that we're on a treadmill. We keep going around the struggles. We fought for ethnic studies. We called it Black studies, but we also talked about ethnic studies, bringing in the studies of the history and the contributions of every ethnic group in this country. Understanding the world itself was a different outlook, and that created a challenge to the system. Various folks did not want it, as they don't want it today. They don't want this discussion. It's been attacked by the academies, universities, ever since it was established. The individuals who have been leadership forces, academics in these areas are under attack. Historically, since '68, there's a constant struggle for this. People are being attacked because many of the scholars are being called not scholarly, or women, particularly who are involved in these struggles, are being called too emotional. That's been the attack. So they're developing better language of how to attack folk. Right now is critical race theory that is developing an understanding of what should be done in teaching and analyzing our history. And other folks are saying that anything that's related to discussing racism in our society is critical race theory, and it should not be part of any curriculum or part of any program, and governments in various parts of this country are attacking it. That was being done in those days. It is a struggle for everything we've gained and fought for. We're constantly fighting against it again. We fought and supported the movement to end slavery, and we ended up with a system of wage oppression, and particularly in the agricultural industry, where people were pretty much enslaved in much of the same way as you talked about before. We're constantly making that fight. We make gains. We do have ethnic studies. We do have more students. We fought at San Francisco State against the increase in cost. I remember that we paid $48 for a semester. I did, I didn't have it, so I had to do all kinds of things to get it. And they wanted to raise it $2, and we made that part of our strike. Now it's astronomical, the cost of going. And what is that astronomical cost to Black folk? What is it to working people? What is it to all the folks who have to do the hard work? They get up on and take the early bus families that Jesse Jackson talked about. What does that do for all these people who have to go to school? The struggle for free education is still a main struggle, and we're making that fight. We were part of that struggle in the 60s. So we faced the struggles around voting rights. We're facing that right now. We're facing the struggle, as I said before, around how to deal with education in our society when racist education has been under attack by all of us in the movement, and yet there are very powerful forces in government coming from the last administration, but not just that last administration. It's coming from both Democratic and Republican administrations historically in this country. The pushback against Black folk making advances, and as Black folk make advance, that's always been part of the struggle for everybody making advance. For women, for every ethnic group and every economic group has made advances as a result of pushing hard. The descendants of slaves made that struggle and were the leading force in that struggle for a long time and set the examples for how it can be done. I have this discussion here about what happened with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Paula Murray being the leading force. People should read her books and understand who Paula Murray is. It is particularly important for women to understand, Black women to understand, lawyers to understand that Paula Murray as a lawyer helped to build that movement because of her own experience, not from some philosophical, ideological approach towards it, but from her own experience, built an understanding of how to fight in the legal system to end racist oppression and racist discrimination for her and that impact on large numbers of people. The basis for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's what we've engaged in. I'm going far afield, I suppose. But
no, I was just going to say,
this is the struggle we're talking about.
Right. No, I see so many parallels in what you were fighting for and even my own life experience. So while you were at San Francisco State and you were dealing and the other students of color there and, poor white students dealing with a rising tuition and struggling and trying to find a way to stay at the university, I'm reminded of my time at Cornell University. And I remember I started with a meal plan where I got 3 meals a day. And the tuition was constantly rising. There were all these books that the professors wanted you to buy, many of them books that they had written, so you could boost their sales of whatever books they had. And I was struggling financially. And I remember I went from having 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day because I could not afford that meal plan anymore. And then I had to go down to 10 meals a week. And then I went down to 5 meals a week. And then I realized I could not afford the university meal plan at all because I needed that money to cover the tuition. And every year it would go up, and every year the contribution of my parents went up. But I come from very humble beginnings. My father was a janitor at the post office. My mother cleaned houses. My mother cooked meals at the local school. They did not have any money. So the only way that tuition was getting covered is I was working 2 jobs, and I still never seemed to have enough money. So food was the one thing that I had to do without. And so I think many people, many young people are still having those same struggles. The tuition is rising. You have food insecurity. You have all of these different things. You touched on another point that I thought was powerful, and that's critical race theory. So right now, in 28 states, they have passed laws that prohibit the discussion, chilling the discussion of the contributions of Black people and brown people and Asian people and Native American people and LGBTQ people. It has gone from just critical race theory, which, by the way, was never taught in secondary school, to chilling any discussion about diversity, chilling any positive depictions of people of color, and also preventing us from having the real conversations about what racism, systematic racism, really looks like. They don't want our children to learn about you and the struggles that you had and the battles that you fought. They want our children to be miseducated. They want our children to be ignorant, but not just the children. They want the general population not to have any of this information. So we go from not simply being denied resources and denied the opportunity to educate ourselves and better ourselves, the opportunity to own property, the opportunity to have that property appreciate, right? There's all these stories about appraisers undervaluing property owned by Black people and Black people having to hide our Blackness and pretend that we're white in order to get a fair price for property that we're trying to sell or property that we're trying to refinance. Not only is all of that happening, but they don't even want us to learn our history. So if you have a message for people who are listening to this, what is it? And why is it so important that we know our history, know where we come from, know about your contributions and everybody who has been part of this struggle?
Well, there's a history of struggle that people have to become aware of and understand what that is. Education is key to moving forward. It's key to understanding how we are going to make advances in this society, and developing some critical analysis of what has happened in the past. Once you know facts, then you have to figure out what those facts mean and the impact of those facts. Developing the ability to work with other folks, to see the need to be part of community efforts, to be part of group efforts, not being individuals standing out. Individual work is important, individual courage is important. But my message is that we have to constantly struggle and understand that the society we live in wasn't built around the ideas that we think are so important to us. And if we want to realize those ideas, that idealism, that's the conundrum that we face is how to realize the idealism that we think that we're built upon, and develop a better society for ourselves. I talk occasionally at some various places. I spoke at William and Mary about where we go from here. And one of the things I talked about at William and Mary, of course, is a college law school that was developed, named after the King of England, the Queen of England, and her husband, the King. William and Mary law schools developed by Thomas Jefferson across the country. We don't know what they are, but they were built with slaves, built by slaves and built upon slaves. And law students went to those schools with their slave servants. Not everybody could go to law school. We know that. You and I could not have been lawyers in that system. Most of the people on this call could not have been lawyers in that system. We couldn't get into law schools. Those changes have been made. And we have to understand that system was built upon white supremacy. Now, we can say that there were good aspects to what folks wanted to do, but we are living in a system that was built upon the primacy of white men around white man's culture and white man's economics. The church before that had divided the world up for white folks, European white aristocracy, and that was to dominate because that was the dominant paradigm that we had to live with. And we understand that. We have to understand that about our country, about our history, and understanding that helps us to build a more democratic society, a society that's more inclusive. We can't get there until we reach that. And that's what's difficult for the dominant culture in the society, the dominant political culture of the society to accept. And it's difficult for a lot of folks because of our own educations. We find it difficult to say this is a white supremacist-based government. The Constitution was based upon the power and privilege of white men. It didn't include anybody else. It said what other people were regulated to, but it did not include other folks being in that power structure. And that included women. It included all the ethnic groups that we live in, the national groups. And it certainly included Black folk who were slaves, the prominent aspect of that. We have been able to make some changes because we constantly fight. And we know that if we constantly fight and understand what we go through and how we can make a society based upon our own experience, things can get better, things will change. And I think that's the message that's important to get now.
There's a powerful image that I would like to share, and it's right here. And this is a picture of you as a young man desegregating a movie theater. I think it's powerful because it's real, right? This is not just some theory. This is not something that just happened in a book. This is you right here in this picture. Can you tell us what you were thinking, what you were feeling, and how you had the courage to fight systematic racism right here in this photograph?
Mm. When I look at that photograph, I see myself and I understand what my emotions were. I'm looking at the owner of the manager of the theater. That theater Carolina Theater was owned by the city of Durham. So it was, in that sense, public. There were other theaters that we were part of and desegregated at that time. And there's a cop there with his hand on his gun. I'm a high school student, and I'm trying to figure out how to negotiate this situation with my friend who's there, and we're at the ticket box, and we're going in. Oddly enough, the movie that was playing was Sergeant's 3. And if you know Sergeant's 3, it had Sammy Davis Jr. in it, part of the Rat Pack movie. And we were going to go not to the crow's nest, because there was a crow's nest upstairs that was segregated theater. Black folk had to go climb the outside stairs like a fire escape to the upstairs, and we were in the crow's nest upstairs, where only Black people were allowed to. Only place we could go watch a movie, and we thought that was an affront to our dignity. And as young people, we were not going to accept that, and we were paying lots of money every week. People were going to see movies, and the movie theater was making tremendous amounts. So we were saying, we want jobs at this theater, and we want to end the segregation. We want the dignity of being able to sit in the orchestra downstairs and walk in the front door into this movie theater. And they were violently opposed to that. I mean, people got hurt in the movement trying to do that. And as a young man, what bothers me so much is that I had to figure out in negotiating that how I could not confront those folks in a way that scared them and get shot. At the same time, we were not going to move away from our demand, and we didn't stop the picket line. We didn't stop the round robins that we had going through the theater, and we eventually were able to desegregate that theater with a tremendous mass movement in other theaters in North Carolina. But that was.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but what happened to you after this picture was taken? Were you taken into custody? Did they just give you a warning? What happened to you here?
We had thousands of people outside. So I walked out of the theater. No, they didn't want to arrest us at that time because we had already filled up the jails and many times with demonstrations. So we had thousands of people outside, and they were just going to deny us. If we were to force our way in, it would have probably been more violent. I remember at one time I did get through the line. We had students from Duke, was an all-white university at that time. Duke didn't integrate until much later, and we were able to get somebody buy tickets for us, and we walked in very quickly and rushed in. And I'm sitting there in the dark with a couple of people and saying, "What the hell am I doing? I'm here in the dark in a theater where I'm surrounded by folks who don't want me here." And anything could happen. But at this time, we were able to walk out of the theater and continue our demonstration. This was going inside trying to buy tickets and talking to the manager and saying that this theater is publicly owned and you need to let us in. And we ended up with lawsuits and so forth, but we finally integrated. This police officer was a mean rascal.
One other thing I wanted to point out is the body language. And I know you just said you wanted to appear non-threatening to the officer, and I see your hands are visible and you're holding your hands. And that fear that you had is because you didn't want to give them any excuse to attack you or kill you. Is that a fair?
Right.
Yeah. What's interesting is that we're dealing with the same thing right now. And I've talked at other programs about my interactions with law enforcement. I've had cops pull guns on me. I've had cops point guns directly at my head. Even as an attorney and a partner at a law firm and a leader in the bar association, I have been stopped while driving my car and asked, why am I, how could I afford the car that I'm in? And I'm always thinking in those interactions, and I think every Black man in America is thinking when they're stopped by the cops, is how do I get out of this situation without ending up dead, right? Because we know that because of the color of our skin, the way that we look, that there are some folks who will find us threatening just because of the color of our skin. And we know that in most instances, if we are killed, murdered by the police, nothing will happen. We've had the George Floyd case with Derek Chauvin convicted, but that's one in a million, right? In the majority of cases, you kill a Black man, you kill somebody who looks like me, nothing is going to happen to you. And I won't be there to give my side of the story anyway. Do you have any advice for Black men who may be watching this video, or other men of color who are trying to figure out how to conduct themselves when they interact with law enforcement in a way where they don't end up dead? What advice do you have? What should you do when you're stopped by the police and you're trying to figure out how to navigate that situation and come out alive? What should we do?
I think I've evolved to some extent from that experience as a high school student fighting in North Carolina and other places. I think for me, it's important to maintain my dignity. I don't think I would say we should go at somebody swinging. I think that we have to not have the approach of confronting in a way that allows the police officer or the authority to become violent against us, so that they don't have that excuse. But I think we have to stand strong and firm. I am no longer willing to say that we have to have some of the approaches that we are told to have, is that be non-threatening. I don't know what non-threatening is today, because non-threatening in some ways is threatening to my own personal well-being, my identity, myself, and my family. There's one photograph of me being arrested in Oakland in 2010, and that arrest was at a demonstration where we were protesting. 2010, obviously, it was Oscar Grant and Bluford and Alan Bluford. I represented his mother at various times, and worked with Wanda Johnson, who's the mother of and I think that one of the things that is important to say is that we need to fight more. I got arrested and going into my office that was at 1440 Broadway, right between 14th and 15th on Broadway.
Is this the photo that you were referencing?
This is the photo. This is the photo that I was referencing. And as I was going into my office door, there were people massing, and I had been involved in being on the line, demonstrating and talking to folks during that day and that night. I've been on the streets at night in many of the demonstrations that have occurred. I can tell you a story about, various times standing out there between cops and demonstrators where cops had shotguns and ready. But in this case, what's so outrageous about this is that when I got arrested opening my office door, the cop was going after my son, and I wanted him inside. My son is bigger than I am, I'm a Black man. And I knew that if he got arrested out there, he would probably be hurt. And I also had to keep from acting in such a way that my son came and defended me. But what happened is a cop, CHP, walked up to me, put his hands around my throat, not a carteret hold, but a illegal hold, his hands around my throat, and choked me, and then handed me off to another officer, who handed me off to another officer, so that I could not be identified as being arrested by the officer who choked me, or the subsequent officer who could say he saw what happened, and who handed me off. So I could never find out who the officer was that choked me. And Oakland Police Department participated in that and took me into jail. And even though I had been choked, and I told them I had been choked, got to the police department after sitting in a car in the paddy wagon for hours and hours. The doctor at the police station, which is necessary for them when they're arresting particular crowds of folks. If someone's been hurt, is supposed to examine them, but he refused to examine me. I had sores, and I should have been examined, but he refused to. The doctor was a black man. People refuse to take on the system because they cannot understand why people or accept that people are protesting and they need to support that. You can do your job and you can do it well, and you could have done it right by just participating and saying, you can't put this guy in jail. You can't put him in a cell right now. And they put us in a cell that night that was so full that nobody could sit down or lay down. And that was true for all the cell. And people allowed that. And the black police officers and some of those folks who are now playing a leadership role in the police department were there and saw it happen and allowed it to happen and didn't protest against it and didn't say it shouldn't happen. We live in a system where too much cooperation with the racism, oppression that occurs, racist conduct that occurs is part of and parcel of folks figuring out how to get along. These are things that bring up these both emotional, I think, and objective kind of analysis about what's going on for me as I talk about our experiences. But this is the world we live in, and the fight has to be one where we recognize that we need to figure out how to agree that there is something wrong, and something wrong in the system is not just some intellectual discourse. It is, in fact, there are practical ways that we can approach it in our everyday life, and every one of us, whatever role we play as lawyers in our society, in our community, but in our official work, we can do something about it, and we just need to say something. We also need to act on what we understand is happening and say we can't allow this. Those are the people who have courage to fight, the people who have the courage to make the change. And I'm proud to see young folk doing it, and I want to encourage you to continue in that direction, because it's always difficult in your job, and people who are in jobs like you, black and non-black folks, are encouraged to figure out how to get along with all the folks around them. We see those things being challenged on television and stories, but in your actual work, you have to figure out how you get along and be respected by the folks, and have them think of you as somebody who is useful and understand your value and importance, while you at the same time say, there's some shit that's going on that I can't accept.
I want to just take a moment, if I can, to thank you for sharing your trauma with us. So many Black people, especially Black men, have similar stories. Following George Floyd, Charles Houston had 3 mental health sessions. We had one with Black men, one with Black women, and one with everyone together. And there were so many stories similar to yours. I shared my story where I had multiple cops pull guns on me, and I thought I was going to be executed. It's so much pain and trauma that so many of us have. And many people don't realize it. Many people don't realize, here you are, a successful civil rights lawyer with your own firm, but that could not protect you or insulate you from this system that oppresses Black people, that mistreats Black people at the hands of law enforcement in the eyes of those officers. It didn't matter that you were a successful lawyer. It didn't matter all the many accomplishments that you've had over the civil rights movement. They just saw a Black face. And that is the experience that so many of us have. I realize that it does not matter what I do for a living, where I work, what titles I have. When I'm out there on the street, when I'm driving my car, all people see is a Black face. And I think we have a lot of work to do to change the system. We can't escape it simply by going to school and getting educated and getting a good job. We need to change the system. We need to reformat this system that is still built on racism that is causing so much damage. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for sharing that. It seems like so often Black people have to share our pain to educate people because folks don't think it's real. They don't think this really happens, but this still happens. And it doesn't matter who you are or what degrees you have or how much money you have in the bank. You, as a Black person, are still facing this type of issue today. And I'm looking.
I think it's important to say that absolutely, it's so much a part of what we are, and that's what the opponents of critical race theory don't want to be discussed. They don't want the admission of that in our society, and that's what structural racism is, and that's what happens with the folks of it who are engaged with it. I mean, I just read an article that from a study that was recently made reported that Oakland still stops and arrests Black people at a higher rate than anybody else. All the changes that we made in the struggle for in Oakland, we still have a system that we allow to exist with all the officers there and our political power. In the way we exercise our political power, we allow the system to exist where Black people are being mistreated at a greater rate. And I say that when Black people are arrested at a greater rate than any other group in society, it's mistreatment. And we have to see that and see that's real and part of the structure of Oakland, the structure of Oakland Police Department, the structure of the Oakland criminal justice system that allows it to happen. Because if judges start to say, you cannot come in here with that, take that crap away, it would change. I had a case, interrupting, but your train of thought, but a case in the early period of the three strikes when I had a 14-year-old child facing juvenile court. And he was charged with robbery of a person by force. He lived next door to another kid, and he went outside with the kid that they'd been playing with, and they lived there. And he said he wanted to ride the kid's bike, and they had played together for years. And in riding the bike, he pushed the kid, and maybe the kid fell down, and he rode it back around the block and gave it back to the kid. The kid's mother called the cops, and the cops came out and arrested this 14-year-old for forcible robbery of the bicycle. And I ended up in juvenile court. Someplace or another, somebody should have stopped this. This was in the early 90s. Somebody should have stopped this. There was nobody in the Oakland DA's office that stopped it. Nobody in the police department that stopped it, but nobody in the Oakland DA's department stopped it. And it went into the juvenile justice system. And I ended up in front of Cruikshank, who had been a judge in Stockton when I was a public defender, and I knew him. And we got there, and he was sitting in for somebody in the juvenile court system. And the case came up, and Cruikshank said, I did worse shit than that. And I am not going to let this case go forward. But that was somebody. But every other person in that system who saw that, let it happen. And if you know anything about Cruikshank, he was not the most liked by everybody. He and Clinton White had been very strong criminal defense attorneys before they both became judges, and Clinton White is legendary in my mind. Got mistreated in various times at the courts in Oakland by the sheriff's department. But this is just an instance that comes to mind of us having to face what can be done, what we do, and how we sometimes shrink from doing the work that we could do or the conduct that would make a difference, and begin to develop a different culture. And I'm just encouraging you and everybody else to, as young people and all the people you can influence, to develop ideals. I just heard somebody say that if you're young and you don't have idealism, then you don't have a heart. And I want everybody there everyone who has the opportunity to have a heart, find it.
Well, you've really hit on an important issue, and that's representation. there's some folks who think that if we just had more Black judges and Black district attorneys and Black people in power or other people of color in power, that that would somehow fix everything. But the reality is that, and there's two parts to this reality. Number one, there's a common phrase that we use in the Black community: all skin folk ain't kinfolk, right? Just because somebody looks Black, it doesn't mean that they have the best interests of the Black community or a person of color, et cetera. But at the same time, you also have people who are people of color in positions of power who want to be liked. They don't want to rock the system, and they don't feel empowered, or they won't allow themselves to be empowered to actually make the kind of changes that we need to help better the community. So what are your thoughts on the role that people of color in power have in trying to change the system? Can we just put a bunch of Black judges and DAs in place and expect it to work, or is there something more that has to be done?
Something more has to be done. It's never been enough just to have Black folk in representation. It's important to have that. It's important to fight for that. But, you know, I fought for and was part of the movement in the 50s and 60s fighting for Black folk to be on the police force. And Black folk got on the police force and hit us as hard as everybody else did. There's a whole lot of documentation and research that shows what happens when people don't fight the system that they're in and become part of the esprit de corps. But that's been part of the struggle around the world. You know, I do a lot of work in Haiti, and right now the struggle in Haiti has been Black folk in the system that's part of the oligarchy, connected to the oligarchy, that makes oppression viable in Haiti, that keeps it going. They work with other state departments outside of the country to oppress folks, and our struggles right now is who's going to be the person that's going to exploit the masses more. And sometimes it happens right here in Oakland. I think it's incumbent of everybody who is in a position to think, how can they advance in their position to make a change in society? If we say there's racism in society in general, or racism in this country, there's institutional racism, then it's got to be true in Oakland. And where do we find it? And what do we do? And what particular things we do other than talk about it? What particular things we do to see that changes? How is that going to change for us as lawyers in the courtroom? And how is everybody on this call going to say to other folks how it's going to change? I know probably everybody has been into sensitivity training, and I've been in sensitivity training with the lawyers, and many lawyers go through it because they have to, and they think it's crap. I think that's true in the institutions. It certainly seems to be true in the Oakland Police Department. It seems to be true in many other aspects of law enforcement. Why isn't it true in the DA's office? Why isn't it true in every office that we're engaged in? It's not damning to say that we live in a society that's founded on racist superiority, supremacist systems. There's so many aspects of our system that try and find and elevate individuals above other folks to find, and part of the creative drive in our society is to compete with other folks and to find ways of putting them down, becomes part of the motivation. How is that a negative in our lives, in our office, and we walk into a place? And how do we fit into it and help to promote it and develop it and maintain it? It's important for everyone to figure out a way of talking to other folks around them and saying, I'm not accepting certain things. We've had some advances around sexism in the system and the role of women in the judicial system, some advances in the discussion. We have not, even though we have engaged in tremendous struggle in some ways much longer in terms of Black folk and racism, we have not advanced that level of discussion that exists around sexism and what happens in the courtroom. Why is that? I don't know. We have many thoughts about why we haven't advanced that way, and we could talk about it at some other time. But we need to have that level of urgency and fighting in the courtrooms, in chambers, and in the offices, and on the streets, and developing ways of uniting with other folks in this period right now. Individual responsibility for the work that we have to do has to be part of our demand and for accountability. Accountability for what we do, for each other, for ourselves. That means criticisms and self-criticisms without being damning, without being afraid that Black folk are going to take over somehow or another, without being afraid that, you know, your own personal cultural identity is going to be stolen from you. We can be part of and developing and maintaining a diverse society and diverse systems and diverse offices without having to have this kind of fear. And unfortunately, right now, and perhaps in the last few years, it has become the dominant aspect of our society, and there's a fight and resistance to it. And to some extent, that's sort of a contradiction, because all things, nothing is ever complete. But last year, or in 2020, this massive movement of folks who identified racism, who identified with the murder of George Floyd as a racist act that was part of government, it was part of a system, a part of a systemic approach in our society, and challenged it. And not only just challenged it, but put their bodies on the line to oppose it, and made some advances. It was a massive movement, bigger movement than we've ever seen in this country. One of the biggest movements in the world, and had impact around the world, and understanding that there's racism, and this is a racist society still. There's been a pushback against it, and we have to maintain that. But it was tremendously enlightening to see that, to be part of that, and that's something we can build on, and we can build on that with more discussions. I think lawyers have to play a better role, because lawyers tend to be cynics. You know, the old saw, you know, look to your left and all that kind of thing in the classes, and that lawyers can argue both sides of the story, any story, and lawyers have a tremendous role in our society, a bigger voice than many others. People,
you know, there are 2 points. There are 2 points that you made that really resonated with me, and one, there needs to be a focus, especially with folks who get in positions of power where they could make change. There needs to be more of a community focus. I think some folks are too individual focused on what benefits them as opposed to what helps the broader community. Be willing to think about how you can use your voice and your power to help uplift everyone. And then the other is the urgency issue. It seems like in the aftermath of George Floyd, at least where we are today, a lot of that urgency has dissipated. It certainly has dissipated in Congress, because we've gotten absolutely nowhere on the George Floyd Policing Act. A lot of these communities that we're talking about making reforms so that there would be a better relationship between law enforcement and communities of color, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. And we have, as you said, there has been a backlash in response to this Black Lives Matter movement, with all of the critical race theory laws that have been passed in these 28 states. And there's even contemplation in Florida to style a anti-critical race theory law based on the Texas abortion law, where people would be able to sue other people for educating and teaching about the contributions of people of color, about systematic racism, about diversity and inclusion. You would be able to sue somebody for doing that, for providing that instruction, and that person would then be responsible for your attorney's fees. It seems like, and sometimes I find myself getting frustrated, because I can see that we are repeating a lot of the same battles that you have already fought, but it seems like people just don't get it. They don't understand it. They don't seem to care enough about it. Maybe they have too much going on in their family lives, but I just see all of this happening to us, and it doesn't seem like we're doing enough to fight back. It seems like we're more reactive than proactive. And I'm wondering, what words would you have to folks watching this as to why we need to urgently fight to protect and secure our civil rights? Why is this so critical? Why do we need to do this now? We can't wait.
We are in, at this moment, one of the sharpest attacks on the recent developments in civil rights in the last 50 years, perhaps. And if we don't fight back, we will lose. We can look at the laws that you have talked about. We can look at the rhetoric of the folks that you're talking about. We can look at the positions of power that people are in who are addressing these issues and see their responses on both sides of the aisle in Congress and in our communities and in our law schools and in our offices. And we can see that this reaction presently is going to destroy the advances that we have made. And if we destroy the advances that Black folk have made, it's going to destroy the advances of everybody. It's not possible to do it without destroying the advances of everybody, every segment of our society. And it's better organized now than ever before in my lifetime, I would say. We dealt with White Citizens Council, Ku Klux Klans, and political power, but we were on the side of movement, the curve. We were on the upside of the curve. We're on the downside right now because of our responses, because of the divisions in our society, because of the both economic and political divisions in our society. So many people who are members of the Charles Citizen Bar Association are doing well enough that that's all they want to do for themselves or their children. Sometimes they don't even really care about their children, quite frankly, in terms of what they do, in terms of the work that they do and changes in commitment to social change. But we're on the downside of the curve right now. And if we don't fight back, and if there aren't individuals, small groups of individuals at least, beginning to fight back, then we can't change that curve, that line that's going down, destroying our civil liberties. That's the urgency of it now. The power of the folks in Congress, the power of the right wing, but the power of sort of the moderates dealing with this issues that they don't want to rock the boat too much. Trying to figure out how to win over the right wing, trying to figure out how to find common ground with those ideologies. You can find common ground with people, but not find common ground with ideologies. In our system, we're not doing it. We talked in 2020, courts were talking about, like, we have to make some reforms. But where is that coming from? It is not happening in the courts. It is not happening with any of the judges that we're facing, whether they're in federal courts, state courts, or certainly in the trial courts. It is not happening. It's not happening in Oakland. We're not finding that among the courts where they are determining that they have a role to play. They have to figure out how we are going to maintain the democratic society that we want, how we're going to build towards that. And until we understand that we don't have it, it's moving in a different direction, we can't turn this ship around. We can't change this approach. We look at probably in your lifetime, the chances of losing everything that we've gained. That's how dire it is.
If I could follow up on that, because I don't know if some people really understand, right now in 2022, we have fewer protections for voting rights than we did in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Right now in 2022, we have less freedom to educate our children about the contributions of people of color than we did 50 years ago. Right now, we have fewer protections in housing. Right now, there are fewer protections for women and their ability to control their bodies based on what the posture seems to be at the Supreme Court. Right now, with all of the federal judges that were appointed by the prior administration that don't have a sensitivity to these civil rights issues, we are in greater danger than we've ever been before. Right now, there is an effort to prevent our children from getting the education they need, having the housing they need, having the protection. And if we can't protect our voting rights, what can we do, right? If you cannot hold people in elective office accountable for what they are or not doing for the community, what does it mean? In all of these states where they have nullification procedures, where the state legislatures can actually nullify the votes of the people, that endangers our democracy. It endangers our very system of government. And I feel like we are in great danger. If we can't get the John Lewis, and we just had the picture of you and John Lewis and the Haiti delegation up on the screen. If we can't take action now to protect our democracy, what the heck are we doing? We're not going to have anything. And the time to do it is now. The time to do it is while we still have votes in Congress to pass it. Once we lose those majorities, it's too late. It's too late. And I don't know, I kind of wish that this could be broadcast to 1 million people, 2 million people, 300 million people, because they need to hear about everything you fought for and how close we are to losing all of it, literally all of it. And people just don't seem to get it. Is what should we do to get this word out better? What should we do to try to wake people up? You know, you kind of want to, tap people on the head and say, wake up, wake up, wake up. We're losing our democracy. What can we do?
Thank you for that. That was a very powerful statement. I think that one thing would be good, Alameda County Bar Association should take that segment that you just did and publicize it and push it out, because it is the urgency of now. And it talks specifically, directly about what is the importance of now. But we have to, in addition to everything we do and everything you've said about what we have to do now, is that we have to do more of pushing ourselves and pushing our organizations. We are parts of organizations. Everybody here is a part of an organization, and we need to push the organization to do more. If a bar association represents everybody, then it has to understand it has a responsibility to represent the needs of the folks who have less of a voice, and it needs to understand the direction of the society that we're engaged in and how it's going to play a role in that. Bar associations have always done that, and there's absolutely no reason your powerful statement should not be the bannerhead of the bar association here and every association. I'm moving that the bar association puts that statement out, cuts it out, and puts it out in a very, very effective and promote it to everybody and every member of the bar in California.
Thank you. I appreciate that, sir. Is there anything that encourages you? We've talked about our frustration. We've talked about things that aren't happening, things that are going the opposite direction. But is there anything that gives you hope that we're going to end up on the right side of history as we move forward?
Well, being in the movement is always challenging to have hope. And that's been part of my struggle is to continue it. And so I cultivate it. I do have hope. I have hope that people can move, that people can change. I see change occurring in my lifetime. I've seen it historically over the last 150 years. I would see that it's possible to move forward. I think this kind of discussion, when I'm in the middle of it, it's always encouraging. And I think we need more of it. I do believe that there are enough people just in Oakland that are progressive, that want to see a better society, that understand that there are not just some mistakes and inequalities in society, but there needs to be structural change in our government, our society, and the way we relate to people. But in our own political organizations, I think that can make a difference. We are dealing with environmental disaster. We're dealing with the possibility that our country, our lives won't be livable, and because of the ecological disasters that are likely to occur. But within that context, there's going to be tremendous struggles around individuals and groupings of individuals. People will be fighting around because of scarcity. People will be fighting around because of objective conditions being changed and pits people against each other. And if we don't do all these things together, we are looking at, in the next 50 years, tremendous disasters, ecological disasters, social disasters, the struggle between individuals and intergroups. The dystopian view of what can possibly happen is something that's real. And it's part of the urgency of now, is to see that. But I do have hope, and constantly hope that there's so much developing around the ecology, the movement around the world, the movement to make change, the movement to recognize that the disasters that we are facing every day in our environment can be changed. We can be moving towards better protection for ourselves. Talk about all the roles that we can play. I believe that it's possible for the relations between groups of individuals that can change. I believe it's possible for us to understand that the economic differences between the folks that have the vast majority of the wealth and those who have very little is growing, but that the movement of folks at the lower economic echelon in our society can organize and work with other folks. I think that's incumbent upon those folks like us on this call to figure out which side we're on and then move forward. One of the things that I've heard is that the vast majority of the wealth in this country right now is in the hands of the baby boomers. And that will stay that way given the way things move. And doesn't mean that we're all in the 1% or even the top, 5%, but we're there. And those folks who are living their lives to become part of that will be part of the problem. There's a lot more value in our lives when we learn to accept that we are part of a greater society. We are part of a greater movement. We are part of a greater tendency to build a more humanitarian world, and not just our neighborhood, the city, or the state, but the world. And we have to make a commitment to do that. Not looking for just social climbing, and not looking for just careerism, because careerism doesn't get you anywhere at the end of the day.
I agree with you. There's this powerful picture showing you with Black leadership in Durham, North Carolina. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about what's happening in this picture. What are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at the leadership at that time of Durham. There's people who are representing the most significant religious institutions, churches and church organizations there.
Is this you on the left? Is this you on the left
That's
here?
me there.
Okay, you look like the
That's me.
youngest person in the picture.
I am. I'm a high school person there. Yes, I am the youngest person in the pictures because I was there because of my role in the movement, and it's because of my role in challenging these people. I was saying some of the same things I'm saying today to those folks. There's Floyd Mckissick in the back. There's John Wheeler, who's the president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. If you know anything about economics, you might know that Mechanics and Farmers was the leading and the only Black bank at that time in existence, basically the largest Black bank in existence in the country. It's been recently purchased by some larger group. I don't know if it's Wells Fargo or something, but and there are labor leaders in that group. The men who are labor leaders, there are the women who are leaders of labor and social organizations, political actions, and of course, there are women who play a different role. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, playing a different role in the organization, but this represents as it was in that society. Mostly men, but all men who are significantly playing a role in the leadership in every sector of the Durham community. And I was invited to be part of it, or inserted myself, but certainly invited and welcome to be part of it. And that was a time when people could accept that I was calling out folks at that time. At the same time, people understood that they needed to be called out and accepted me for whatever reason. We worked for change. It was the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, as you can see. And this is a group photograph representing that Black population. In Haiti was I lived in the country, but Haiti was the urban area of Durham, where Black folk live on the other side of the tracks, basically, and in segregated South. There were many very nice homes, and many people lived in houses with outside toilets and streets that were muddy and unpaved, and shacks and various kinds of dwellings. But that was the Black community.
Was your life
to some
ever?
extent,
Yes, sir. Was your life ever threatened? And I know we talked about experiences with law enforcement and mistreatment, but this sounds like very dangerous work. Was your life ever threatened because of the civil rights work that you do?
Yeah. In particular, one thing that happened is some county sheriffs came out in front of our house one day, and my dad, coming from a big family, and all of his in-laws were big family members, and we had a lot of family members there, Old South contacts, and Dad told me to go in the house and get your gun. And I came out, and my dad was out at the driveway and saying to the sheriffs that's in the movement, lots of things going on, if you get out of that effing car, I'm going to blow your head off. And people knew him, people knew the family, and they didn't get out of the car. But my life had been threatened. I'd gotten, verbal threats. I had brothers who were in the labor, my brother in the labor movement, and a brother who was in the Army. Fort Bragg at that time in the Civil Rights era would get quarantined every time we had major demonstrations. Fort Bragg was the largest military base in the country, and my brother was, he was intended to be a lifer until he got attacked by white folks and beaten and left for dead, and he resigned from the Army.
May I just comment? That was pretty bold of your father in the South to pull a gun on some white police officers and say, if you don't get out of my effing, driveway, I'm going to blow your effing head off. That took some courage. I don't know many folks who would even have that courage today to say that.
Well, it happened. It happened a lot, quite frankly, in the South. You look at some of the history. North Carolina is where Williams was, head of the NAACP, who decided that they would arm themselves to protect against the Ku Klux Klan and White Citizen Council folks who were rioting in the communities, and they shot back with folks who shot at them. It happened in the in other parts of the South also. My history, I came in contact with a number of folks. Roy Wilkins gave me a lifetime membership in the NAACP. Roy Wilkins, if people don't know, should look him up. You can talk me, say many things about him, but he was a powerful force in developing the NAA and the fight against racism and structural change in that society. I knew Jim Farmer, who was the head of CORE and organized the civil rights, the freedom rides. I knew Fred Shellsworth. I met MLK. Floyd Mckissick was, of course, a really militant leader in the movement, and I got to know many other folks. I spent time with Negro, the summer before he was killed, and I know that what happened in Mississippi is that people began to learn to defend themselves, but it was happening in other places. But I can tell many stories about during my time. I was living in the country. My mother was a maid, like your mother was a maid, or domestic, as we would say when people ask what does their parents do. Say a domestic, but she was a maid. She cleaned houses for a number of people. One of the people she cleaned the house for was a sheriff. Mm. And the sheriff used to talk about me when she was in the room with other folks that had meetings at the sheriff's house. He was a member of the old antebellum family and Mangum. And streets named after him in Durham, North Carolina, and antebellum family, slave owners. He himself promoted himself as a part of the New South, but he couldn't see her when she was in the room, and he knew she was a Riley, and they're in there talking about what to do with Walter Riley. Mm-hmm. And she overheard some of those conversations and some of the threats. I mean, some of the threats. I know you want to talk about some of the things that happened. There's a story in that article about a guy wanted to hang me.
Wow.
One time and having to work.
Well, I see that, and my goodness, I could talk about these really important stories forever, but I see we're coming down to the last 5 minutes. I wanted to do two things. First of all, I want to thank you for taking time to share your story, your life work. I want to thank you for all the sacrifices that you made to protect civil rights, to desegregate public places. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done and the sacrifices you made, and also inspiring the next generation, like myself, to continue this fight. I want to see if anybody else who is in the room has any questions for you and then give you an opportunity to share some final thoughts about what we need to do as we move forward. Let's see. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. What are some of your final thoughts or wisdom? Oh, I see somebody has put a hand up. Julie Roche. Hey, Julie. I think you're on mute. I can't hear you. We still can't hear you. Not sure what the audio issue is. Maybe if you write your question, Julie, and then I'll ask it. I don't know what the audio issue is. Anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Okay. Oh, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so sorry about that. Thank you, Terrance. Thank you, Mr. Riley, for this really great discussion. It's so informative. And the question I have is, I'm involved in the city in Hayward where I work, just as a volunteer in the community. And how do you balance this sort of general need? We just had a community-wide survey last year, and the majority of people want to see more cops on the streets, and they want to see more response to their 911 calls. So how do you balance that with making reforms that really affect the racist tactics that might be going on? Like you said, in Oakland, a lot of work is being done, and this is still continuing. So how do you affect that from a legal perspective or a policy perspective? Like, have you seen things work in other areas that are not working here? How do you move forward with that?
Well, the struggle around police reform is obviously a long struggle. I think Philadelphia is one place where there's some things that are happening. I like what's happening with Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, which is not strictly police reform, but is dealing with criminal justice. But when we're talking about reforming the police and developing a better approach towards policing and what it means to develop peaceful public safety becomes the main topic. We have to have a greater discussion about it and put that forward. The opposition to public safety reform has pushed back and is winning a lot of media battles right now, PR battles, I'd say. Not because the media is wrong, but PR battles. I'm not sure that the majority of people in Oakland want to see more police officers on the street, but that's certainly the narrative that's being pushed. And my experience knocking on doors, and I've been doing it for a very long time, is that people have different ideas about what policing is and what it should be. And people have different ideas right now about how we can have peace in our communities and developing that. But there's also a responsibility for folks who play a leading role, who have power and sought position to give leadership to in our civil life, to use their understanding and give leadership around the issues of how we can make change. If you want safety, public safety, we know that more policing does not end up with greater public safety. Police don't end up with murder. Police respond to crimes. They don't prevent crimes. And that education needs to take place. And it's so easy in our society. It's particularly so easy for white folks who don't want to talk about public safety in a way. I mean, not every white person, but as part of the paradigm is not wanting to talk about public safety in a way that benefits changing the society of Black folk and people of color, basically, because those are economic issues, and those mean challenging the system that we live in. So I don't know that at this moment I can give you the answer to how we change everybody's minds. But one way minds get changed is by actions and organizations. When I was engaged in sitting in various places on the bus that I was not supposed to sit, and people would say, you can't change society. You can't change these things by forcing folks to change their minds. Well, one of the things that happened is that the laws of desegregation actually changed society. There's nobody right now organizing to say that Black folks have to sit on the back of the bus. That was my life. I became a bus driver and knowing that that was not the case. That's true for lunch counters. It's true for social integration. Nobody's saying that right now. Police reform, public safety reform is going to occur in the society, or we're not going to have a society. We're not going to. People are not going to allow the kind of racist demagoguery, oppression, and violence that is occurring in our society, and the economic disparities are not going to change very much until we actually make systemic change in the way we relate to each other. Public safety is an absolute part of that. People have to get on board with that, or they're going to actually be left behind, and they're going to suffer in their minds, they're going to suffer in their neighborhoods and their communities, and feel isolated and unwanted. But that's what's going to happen, you know. Even though we're not in the ascendancy at this moment in Oakland around public safety, we will be. And I mean, just accept that, and don't expect all of us in the movement for change to give the answers to what's going to happen. You can't do that any place. You can't even do that when you engage in a legal battle and a lawsuit. That's not what you do. You talk about what's wrong, point out what's wrong, and organize to identify the inequities and say that those can't exist anymore. That's what we do. That's what you do as a lawyer. And don't come claiming that we have to have some other kind of approach when we talk about public safety. I'm not trying to be negative and critical about the question and analysis, but the question begs the issue. What do we need to do to change? It's what we have to do to reach what we want. If we don't have the vast majority of folks in line with that, then we have to figure out how to make that happen. And I think public discussion is part of it. But I actually see the organizations are becoming so effective. Anti-Police Terror Project, I believe, is becoming very effective in developing its message. I think that while it's radical to so many people, it is being discussed. Public safety is now on the minds of folks. We got to get the media to start talking about public safety as opposed to talking about defunding police. We have to talk about how we spend our resources, how we organize our time. That's going to make the change and make the difference, I believe.
Thank you so much, Julie.
I don't want to be, but I'm argumentative anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Mr. Riley. It looks like we are out of time, but I just wanted to thank you again for taking time to share your very powerful story, your powerful life story, and all the sacrifices you made. We greatly appreciate it, and I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. And thanks for everybody who attended this program. We appreciate all of you, and we thank the Alameda County Bar Association for sponsoring it, and Charles Houston and everybody else for co-sponsoring. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really great panel.
I'd like to get the comments. I'd like to get the chat comments, but because I didn't get them, can I?
Oh, sure. You know what? I will copy those chat comments right now.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
I saved the chat as well.
Okay, perfect.